everyone. Welcome to Crisis Intervention. Today I just want to recap some of what hopefully you've already learned, but I want to make sure as we go through this PowerPoint that you are able to understand all that you need to know about what the difference between a crisis and an emergency is. So a crisis is the perception of an event or a situation as an intolerably difficult thing that has happened. It exceeds the resources and the coping mechanisms of the person. Unless the person gains relief from the crisis, it has a potential to cause severe affective, which means feelings, cognitive, which means thinking, and behavioral malfunctioning. So a crisis is kind of something that takes place outside of our normal understanding, and it kind of throws us into a place where we don't know how to respond. When we're talking about crisis, it's important to realize that every person who experiences, say, a house fire is not going to respond in the same way. So while it still is a crisis, it is very idiosyncratic, which means there will be individual differences that will take place in the way somebody responds to even the same situation. A psychological emergency takes place when people are just unable to function in a normal manner. Their judgment is impaired. They can't care for themselves or other people. There's sort of a suddenness or an abruptness to it. And really, the goal of social workers or any type of helper in a psychological emergency is to try to protect the individual from hurting themselves or other people. In a crisis, what happens is that people become overwhelmed. They experience a sense of disequilibrium. So if you look at life as a balancing act, basically they've been completely thrown off balance and they can't seem to find a steady state. This vulnerability does not place them in immediate danger of harming themselves or others, but it could precipitate a psychological emergency, which is what we just discussed. There are 4 different types of crises that are discussed in your workbook. The first one is the developmental crisis, and this occurs at the different shifts in our lives. For example, graduating from college, getting married, you're having your first job, having your first child, retirement, maybe the beginning of the semester if something happens with one of your classes. These can precipitate a developmental crisis. A situational crisis is when some sort of an uncommon event occurs and you can't control it or you can't forecast it. Perhaps somebody gets harmed in some way that you love in a car accident. Maybe there is a fire, a house fire, rapes, shootings, illness, a diagnosis, death, job loss, divorce. These are all situational crises that can happen in life. An existential crisis, these are inner conflicts that can accompany important human issues of joy, happiness, love, responsibility. This happens when an individual suddenly realizes that some interpersonal aspect of their life has never been fulfilled. This might be defined as like a midlife crisis that we hear about, where people realize, oh, is this my life? So that would be an existential crisis. And the last one would be called a systemic crisis. And these are different because these kind of crises ripple out into large segments of the population and the environment. Natural disasters, hurricanes, acts of terror, war, these are all systemic crises that can put people into a place of feeling vulnerable. So the next definition that we want to look at is the definition of trauma. So trauma happens when normal patterns of development are altered due to perceived an enormous sense of helplessness or a threat. People's beliefs about the world are permanently changed when they've been traumatized, and psychological trauma due to an event that can happen over an extended period of time. So it could be a one-time incident that causes trauma, or it could be something that's taken place over a long amount of time, such as child abuse. Trauma really results in this extended fixation on the event that causes the problem. What happens in a situation where someone experiences trauma is that this experience is not integrated into their memory. It's like they're still reliving it over and over again, singular event or the series of events that takes place over time. So it's as if it's still happening in that person's mind. So it continues to intrude into the lives of people who are suffering from trauma well beyond the typical 6 weeks. One thing I didn't mention under crisis was that a typical crisis lasts for between 4 and 6 weeks. And people, we can't live in a crisis state. We're always trying to get back to that steady state or homeostasis rather than be in a state of disequilibrium or unbalance. But trauma does not subside after just 6 weeks. Trauma is something that person has to live with for a long period of time. So again, as I just said on the last slide, sometimes, again, trauma doesn't just subside after 6 weeks. People sometimes reenact the trauma time and time again. If somebody grew up in a situation with domestic violence and they were traumatized as a child, sometimes as an adult then they would seek out relationships, and these relationships would result in domestic violence. Not that they're asking to be in a situation of domestic violence, but it's what's familiar to them. And so they are reacting based out of the trauma that they grew up with. Trauma remains rooted in the person's life, and it remains a contemporary experience. It's not something that has been accepted as being long past. So these are really, some of the intrusions can take different shapes. There can be nightmares and flashbacks, intense emotions, rage, panic. These are also felt by people who have been traumatized. So we'll talk about that more in the week that we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. So what is crisis intervention? Hopefully you're already well versed in this from the last 2 weeks of class. But just to review, really what crisis intervention does is it targets the distortions that have been generated by either the problems that have been neglected or unexpected traumatic events. And it kind of helps people recognize and correct their feelings, their behaviors, and their perceptions to approximate a more normal pre-crisis functioning. The purpose of crisis intervention is not the same as the purpose of long-term therapy. Crisis intervention is really about helping somebody come back to their pre-crisis functioning. So that's a very important thing to remember about crisis intervention. So when we're doing crisis intervention, our treatment focuses on a single issue that is of immediate concern, with the purpose of being to help the person quickly reclaim balance in their life. So we're focusing quickly on the problem, and that is also important in crisis intervention versus when you are in principles of interviewing and counseling. It was really about taking time to build relationship and build rapport with somebody that you are counseling. In crisis intervention, we quickly focus on the problem. We don't spend as much time building rapport, because if you do spend time building relationship with somebody in crisis, they think that you're ignoring their problem, and they probably will not continue. So it's a very action-oriented approach that rapidly engages students. So that's going to be one of the differences in principles of interviewing and counseling and crisis intervention. In crisis intervention, the skills that you're going to need for counseling are very similar. You need to be able to accurately listen and respond when somebody makes a statement. You're going to have to assess, analyze, synthesize, diagnose, explore alternatives, and plan and solve problems. These are all really important, as they would be in traditional therapy. But in crisis intervention, it's really, the time frames are really short, and rapid decisions have to be made. So the difference is the creation of a cure or a movement of a client to a more self-actualized behavior is not an end goal in crisis intervention, where it would be in a therapy setting. Returning the client to as close to the pre-crisis functioning as possible is our goal. Is this really possible? What does this mean? What if pre-crisis functioning was still crisis living? These are all things that we're going to talk about this semester, and it's really important for us to kind of change our mindset and let go of some of the judgments that we have about how people live. It's important to remember our social work ethics when we're talking about crisis intervention, and the idea that we really have unconditional positive regard for our clients and aren't overwhelmed by their stories, because they'll know if we are, and it'll be hard for us to help them. So our textbook developed, the folks that wrote our textbook developed this model, the 6-step model of crisis intervention. These are smooth and fluid steps. They're constant, and there's a need for dynamic assessment and evaluation. You don't always go 1 through 6 in these steps. You go 1 to 2 to 3, then maybe back to 1, and then over to 4. So it's really important that we learn these steps, but that we understand that they're flexible. We have to evaluate the client's past and present situational crisis in regard to their ability to cope. How are they going to be able to handle the situation? We have to be able to respond to any personal threat that they may have against themselves or other people, the amount of lethality, their degree of mobility, and the type, and the amount and the direction of action needed by the worker. So on page 7 of your workbook, and it's in your textbook as well, I love the chart that's figure 1.2 of systematic model. And it talks about how assessing is kind of the dynamic, ongoing process that goes on. You'll see in the box on the left, it's listening, and the first 3 steps of the 6-step model are really involve listening. The first one is define the problem, the second one is ensure client safety, and the third one is provide support. Then you move over to the right side and you'll see the action portion, where acting becomes involved in the intervention. And there's different levels of action, and we're going to talk about that too. But then the last 3 steps are examine alternatives, make plans, and obtain commitment. So these are called the rules of the road, and it's a systematic model. They're also on page 8 in your workbook, and really good. But you're going to need to really memorize these, because these are really going to help you as we go through different cases, figure out how you're going to provide intervention. So these are kind of the key underpinnings that you need to know.